If you're looking to purchase a property here in BC, one of the parts of the process that I think gets overlooked most often is the actual contract or offer itself. Now, the reason being is that there's so many other things going on. You're so focused on finding that perfect home and making sure that you don't make the wrong decision that when it actually comes down to offer time, that a lot of people don't fully understand what they're signing. And when making the largest purchase, most likely of your life, it's important that you do know. And like every other part of the buying or selling process, I want to make sure that my clients are educated so they can make well-informed, confident decisions at the end of the day. I always want to make sure that you have a foundational level of understanding so you know why you're doing everything. Essentially, I'm never going to tell you what without a why behind it. And so that's why in today's video, I'm going to be going over BC's residential contract of purchase and sale. And just before we dive into it, if you are interested in more videos just like this one, as well as community tours across the Lower Mainland, I suggest you consider subscribing to our channel. Our goal here on this channel is to educate consumers on both the real estate industry itself, as well as the areas that we service. And with so many ongoing changes on a weekly or monthly basis, it's important to stay up to date. Because for instance, this contract of purchase and sale has already been updated multiple times over the last couple of years. And I'm sure I'll probably be remaking this video in just a year or two again. But I digress, and let's get right into it. So first of all, let's get started on the first page of the residential contract of purchase and sale. And so the first two pages are actually just informational, talking about some of the aspects within the contract, but they do not form part of the contract itself. So I'm not going to go through these in detail, but this form is pretty easy to find online, or if you're already working with a real estate agent, you've probably seen it before. So moving on to page 2, the first important thing we're going to come across is these customary costs. And so essentially this outlines what is to be paid by the seller and the buyer so that you're not hit with any sort of hidden expenses at the end of the transaction. So from the seller's perspective, they're going to be paying for lawyer or notary fees, costs of clearing title, including investigating title, discharge fees, encumbrance holders, prepayment penalties, not getting into the specifics there, real estate commissions, which are going to include GST on top. So for the sellers, the largest costs realistically are going to be their lawyer or notary fees and their real estate commissions. On the buyer side, they're also going to have lawyer or notary fees, as well as some other things such as land and title registration fees, survey certificate, costs of mortgage. Now, most of the time, there isn't going to be a cost to the mortgage, potentially an appraisal. It really just depends on who you're working with and the lender, but generally, the mortgage broker's fee is actually paid for by the bank, so you're not going to have any additional costs here. And then making sure that you have insurance, sales taxes if applicable. So generally, GST is only applicable on new build or substantially renovated projects. Won't get into the specifics around that, but essentially any new construction, whether it's built or in the process, there's going to be GST on that, but there isn't on resale. And then the other big one is going to be property transfer tax. So just very quickly, the exemption for first-time buyers here in BC is if it's under $500,000, you're exempt. Under $525,000, but above $500,000, it works on a sliding scale. However, unfortunately, there's not a lot of properties that are under this price point. So I have other videos on this. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but these are the ones that you're going to need to know about. And if you have a good agent, what they're going to do is actually have you initial off and make sure that you understand what these are when you're signing the contract. Now, moving on to page number 3, or essentially page number 1. So this is the actual first page of the contract of purchase and sale. And so as you can see, starting at the top, you're going to have your agent's brokerage or the buying agent's brokerage, dependent on what side you're on. But we'll look at this from a buyer's perspective, the address of the brokerage, and then who the offer was prepared by. So more often than not, it should obviously be your agent. And then below this, we're going to have all the contact details. And then up here, as you can see on the right-hand side, this date right here is the date date that the original offer was written. So even if you've gone back and forth multiple times over a 3, 4, 5 day period negotiating, this is the original date the offer was written, which will be important later on. Just make sure it's right. And then phone number of your agent's brokerage, and then the MLS number. So if it is a property that is on the MLS, this will already be automatically inputted in here through web forms, which is the software that this contract is on and that your real estate agent would likely be using. And so moving on, then we're gonna have the buyer's information and seller's information, so full legal names. They've actually recently changed it to 3 buyers, and sometimes we actually see more than 3 buyers on the contract, but just with the way prices are going, we've seen more often than not that sometimes you need to have more buyers to actually be able to afford the property. And then here you're going to input the actual address of the buyers at that point in time, as well as the city and postal code down here. And then as for the sellers, same information. Most likely the address is going to be where they're currently living, but if it's a tenanted property, it may be different. That's something you're going to be able to take from the title search if it's updated. Now, one thing we do sometimes notice is that the address of the buyers is not provided. Now, I prefer that that information is available, especially for instance, if it's my property that I'm selling, because I want to know who is purchasing that property. Additionally, if I'm able to figure out, do they have any assets? In the rare circumstance that we get into a legal issue, which God forbid that ever happens, but I have heard stories in the past where there were buyers who did not have any assets to their name, and when the sellers went back after them, they actually didn't make sense for them to try and sue or pursue legal action because there was really nothing for them to go after. But that is a whole other conversation. Moving on, then we're gonna have the address of the property and unit number if it is a strata property. So I'll let you know at this point in time, this is a contract for strata properties. So whether you're writing on a detached or a strata property, they're gonna be the same contract. I just have my template for strata property set up in this one. So there may be some differences when we get to the subject and conditions section, but just to keep that in mind as we're going through it. And so then you're gonna have the city and then the PID or the parcel identifier, which is a 9-digit number, but you're also gonna have the legal description of the property. So essentially 3 different places where you're able to confirm that this is the actual correct property and there are no mistakes. And so this information can all be confirmed on the title search. Now, moving on, the most exciting part of this contract is the purchase price. And so if we have a purchase price and we type it in here, it's actually going to come out down here as well in a Word version as well as a numeric version. So let's just take one of the old ones that was in here, 1,150,000. This is just to confirm that maybe there isn't a mistake. Of course, when we have periods and commas, this can get a little bit confusing. I know in other countries, they actually use periods instead of commas to separate the numbers. And again, it's in both places to make sure that there are no mistakes made and that you should be able to confirm between the two, especially in the fact that it automatically fills this one out for you, that you do have the correct figure there. Now, if there is a negotiation, what you're gonna see is these will both be crossed out, or potentially sometimes if it's just wanna change it to 1,140,000, they'll just cross out the 50, write 40 down below and you'll have to initial off, but we'll get to that at a little bit of a later time. Now, just below this is where we see the rescission period. Now, this is one of the newer introductions to the contract and into purchasing homes in BC. And essentially there is this 3-day rescission period where it's supposed to be in protection of buyers who are writing subject-free offers and have some sort of buyer's remorse or something changes and comes up, that they still have the ability to get out of the contract. However, the difference being that they'll have to compensate the seller 0.25% of the purchase price. So what I'm actually gonna do is just make this a little bit simpler so that we'll know exactly what it is. But if it was $1 million, then this number would be $2,500. And so if you have a contract with subjects in it and you're going beyond this 3-day period, this is essentially irrelevant to you. But unfortunately, they've added to the contract. It becomes very confusing for people because they're like, what is this number? I don't understand. Do I owe it? Why is it here? And so the easiest way to think about it, if you have subjects in your contract, they are longer than 3 days, you don't even have to think about it. If you're writing a subject-free offer, this is where this can come into play, because within that 3-day period, you have the ability to back out, but you're going to have to provide compensation to the seller in this amount. But moving on. Now what you'll see at the bottom of basically all the pages except for the final one is we're gonna need initials from both parties. So if you have 2 buyers, gonna need to initial here and here. Sellers, the same thing. Now, the big part of this is just making sure that you've actually seen every part of the contract and been able to review it. And so essentially, if there are any of these boxes that have been missed, given again, if there's only 1 buyer, you only have to sign 1 box. But if you have 2 and one of them has missed one of these boxes, technically it's not an actual legally binding contract. And if anyone was to ever take you to court over this, there would be a very high likelihood that they'd be able to use this argument to get out of given contract. But moving on. Next up, we're going to have deposit. So this deposit number is what will be due typically here in BC and in the Lower Mainland at the end of the subject removal period, which we'll get to next. So even after you've got the accepted offer, you're not going to provide the deposit up front. Sometimes you can. This can be a strategy in negotiation, but that's not what this video is about. But it will be due, as it says down here, by way of bank draft within 24 hours of subject removal. There are other ways that it can be provided. However, this is the way that I've always been taught and I've always liked to do it. And we have it due within 24 hours. The reason being is if for some reason something is going on late on the final night, we don't want to have to be scrambling to try and come up with that deposit. Banks are going to be closed if we haven't got it prior to. This at least gives a little bit of a grace period, but it can also cause for some anxiety on the seller's end, because realistically, until that final deposit has been provided, the deal isn't really firm now. If that was to happen, you go through the legal system. Not going to comment too much on that, but until you have received that final deposit, I never consider a deal to be firm. So in regards to amount of the deposit, the kind of rule of thumb that we use is 5%. Again, it can be higher, it can be lower, it really doesn't matter. It can be as low as $1 and it can be as high as the offer amount on the contract. But typically if it's a $1 million purchase price, we're gonna see 50,000 here. If you wanna strengthen your offer a little bit, then maybe it's 75 or 100,000. But there is no mandatory number. It's typically around 5%. And then moving on, it just states where this deposit will be provided. And so in general here, where it is given to is the brokerage of the buying agent. So for myself personally, it would be Real Broker, and it would be made out to Real Broker in Trust. And so essentially what this deposit is, what I like to call it, is good faith money. So the way I explain it to my clients is this is going to form part of the down payment eventually, but it is the money that you're providing up front to give the seller confidence that you're going to actually go through with the purchase, because God forbid if you go bankrupt or flee the country or something else and you're not able to complete on this deal, essentially the seller is to an extent supposed to be entitled to this amount. At least think of it that way. It's not that simple. It would have to go through the legal process, but I'm not going to get into that. It's just easiest to think about it from that perspective. But moving on, this is going to be the most important part of this video, is the terms and conditions. So your subjects. And these are the things that are in place to protect you. Because just because you've got that accepted offer, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have been locked into that contract. We have this subject removal period, and as long as we have these in our contract, we are given this time to do our due diligence and make sure everything is the way that it appears and there's no major red flags or anything else. So some of the biggest ones that you're going to typically see are home inspection, financing, property insurance, and then technically property disclosure statement and title. And then for a strata property, which we'll see on the second page, is approving and reviewing the strata documents. But just going back for a second, what you're gonna have here is actually fill out the date of when these subjects need to be removed. So I would say in general, what I see is anywhere between 5 to 12 days. Can be shorter, can be longer, but this is generally a pretty good period. Now, if you're going to get a home inspection, which is something I always suggest, that's why we have this in the contract. In regards to financing, getting a mortgage, that is going to be the majority of people unless you are paying cash, or it's funny when we say paying cash. People aren't necessarily paying cash, but they know that they're able to get the financing if maybe they are putting down a large sum of money and they're only looking for a small mortgage or something like that. But if you are looking to get that approved prior to, this is actually the financing clause we're going to want to use. A lot of agents will just use the simpler clause stating that they need to be able to get their financing approved, but there is no specifics. Now, from my understanding and speaking with lawyers, this is going to hold up a lot better in court. The other one won't necessarily. Hopefully you would never get to that point. However, I always just like to play things safe. Moving on, fire and property insurance, ensuring that you can actually get this insurance on the property. Now, generally they won't actually allow you to lock in a rate until you're within 60 days of purchasing the property, but certain things that can change these are, especially in a strata property, if there have been previous claims or if there is specific types of piping or other things of that nature. So here we're just making sure that, number one, that the property is actually insurable, because this isn't typically an issue, but in the past we've seen insurance deductibles of $1 million and certain properties were not even insurable. Now at this point in time, there are options for that, but it's going to be extremely, extremely expensive. So just something you need to know, because of course you need to budget for that in your future. And then the property disclosure statement and the title search. So the property disclosure statement, not going to go into too much detail on what it is, but essentially it is disclosures provided by the seller to the best of their abilities, talking about various different aspects of the property. We'll have a separate video covering this completely, so don't worry about that. And then title search, essentially are there any sorts of charges on title, and making sure that it's actually the owner that has stated that owns the property, and confirming other aspects. But if you have a competent agent, the most of the time, if there's nothing that kind of stands out or you're unhappy or unsure about on the PDS or the title search, you're going to want to actually include those signed and initialed off to the other party when you're presenting the contract. This shows more proactivity and that they know what they're doing and that they're not giving themselves as many outs. Realistically, most agents, if they see a financing or inspection clause, these ones aren't really gonna matter as much to them. However, it just shows that they're proactive, competent, gives you just a little bit of a better edge, and there will be more confidence on the other side, especially from the other agent if they know what they're doing. So we would have it here that you've read and acknowledged and accepts what is on the title search, and the same goes for the PDS as well as the date that is on it. Then once again, initials in the bottom corners of this page. Moving on to strata documents. Typically you're going to want to actually get these prior to writing the offer. However, this can be 300, 400, 500 pages, and you don't necessarily always have time to completely go through them prior to writing that offer. Now, if you do, if it's a slower market, you can also sometimes remove this subject as well. However, I like to definitely have it in there to make sure that we can really dig deep and get a better understanding. And this is going to be so many different things. Form B is going to be the biggest one of the biggest at least for a strata property. All of the minutes for the past 2 years. So generally what we're able to get is minutes from all the meetings for the past 2 years, all of the monthly meetings, the AGMs, and any SGMs. And then of course we want to know about the bylaws and rules of the unit itself. Depreciation report is another big one. Again, I cover the different strata documents in a separate video, so definitely check that out if you want a better understanding of them. But this is one of the most important things that we need to do our due diligence on in a strata property to make sure that we understand both the unit and the complex, how it's run, what its future looks like, and if there's anything to be made aware of. And then some of the other things, just making sure that we're being provided with any subsequent minutes. So between the time that we would actually remove subjects and the time that you're moving in and completion, that we want to have anything that is happening in the strata be provided to us, right? Because we want to know about any sorts of changes. Now, special levy, this is a big one, because if there is a special levy proposed or already in place, we want to ensure that the seller is the one that's taking responsibility and paying, because the worst thing to happen is you move into a place and 2 months later, all of a sudden you're hit with a $10,000 special levy. That would be the absolute worst. So when we're reading through the documents, this is one of the things that we want to really look for and make sure that there are no major ones in the near future, because as I said, this would just be soul crushing in your first property. And then some other things I like to add in there is just access to the property for up to 2 times. So maybe you want to go and do renovations or measurements, or have a contractor or whatever that may be come in to plan for what you're going to do when you actually move in. I just like to have the ability to have this access at a later date, because sometimes you get sellers who are very agreeable and easy to work with, and then other times you have very difficult ones. But if we have it in writing, it makes things a little bit easier. And then again, changes in bylaws. So if there are any changes in bylaws, we want to know about it. And illegal substances. So the biggest one here is, I would say, obviously marijuana growth. There has been an issue in the past in BC, and so more specifically probably pertains to detached properties. However, of course, it can happen in strata properties as well. But if it has been a remediated grow up or something of that nature, generally it's very, very difficult to finance. Basically, no insured mortgage providers, from my understanding, will sign off on this. It has to be very specific. You always have to have at least 20% down, sometimes more. But of course, that's something that we want to know about up front. And then moving on, again, initials in the bottom corners. And then another thing I like to add is this clean condition. So making sure that the seller is going to professionally clean the property with proof of receipt and remove all garbage and refuse prior to the possession date. Now, does this always work perfectly? No, but we always want to do the best of our ability to make sure that you're getting that property in the best condition possible. But if I'd have to say there's one part of the contract that I have the most issues with, it would definitely be this one, and going back, because everybody has a different understanding or expectation of what clean is. Unfortunately, our side typically has a higher one than the other side from my experiences, but I digress. Now, also in here we have the seller warrants that there are no stains or damage to any flooring or under any furniture, area rug, chatels, and there's no damage to drywall or behind wall coverings, wall hangings, or window coverings. So basically that they're not hiding any damage in the property. See this a lot, whether it's a rug or a painting or something else. And we're not going to be taking off every single little aspect of the property. So we're just asking that they're guaranteeing that there is nothing there, because obviously if there is, this will come up or it will come back when you actually move in. And then keys and remote controls. So of course, getting into the underground, fobs, keys to the unit, these sorts of things. It's also added in a different part of the contract. I just like to add it here as well to make sure it's very clear. It is probably overkill, but that's okay. And then property transfer tax. Of course, you want to make sure you understand this, as I already briefly went over what the costs are going to be, as well as if you're a foreign buyer, it's more so a disclosure to you as a buyer that you understand this stuff. So you're signing off and stating, hey, I understand that I'm going to be paying this based on the price of my property, and that it's not going to be a surprise at a later time. And of course, that you're going to be able to have an opportunity to actually get legal and professional advice. That as real estate agents, as much as we advise you on so many different things, you should be seeking further professional advice through lawyers, accountants, whatever that may be, due to your personal situation. So just knowing you've been given the opportunity during this period of time to go out and do those things, and that there are certain questions that we can't answer, unfortunately. And then just in regards to appliances, just making sure that they're going to be the same as when you viewed them last at the property. And of course, if you have a home inspection, this will also enforce that if they have it in the report showing that it was working, and then on the day that you move in, it's no longer working, we're going to have an issue there. Measurements, understanding that yes, they have provided a measurement. They typically will provide the company that has done those measurements, but there can be slight differences. Generally, from my understanding, it's the types of technology and things that they're using. Some measure to the inside of the walls, some measure to the outside of the walls. Could be a difference of 5 square feet, 10 square feet, but you understand that if you want to go in there and do the measurements yourself during the subject removal period, be my guest. You're more than welcome to, but they're just showing you that there can be slight discrepancies in the different measurements, and you have to understand that. Now, if we were to see something substantial, of course, you would want to be doing that prior to. And then moving on, seller authorization. So just that you're able to be provided any sorts of documents that you've asked for, that they have access to, and that the sellers have provided authorization for you to obtain those documents when you're requesting them, whether they're from Strata, whether they're from the city, or otherwise. And then lastly, I have this stigmatized properties aspect of it that basically states that the sellers, to the best of their knowledge, don't know of, biggest one can be any deaths in the property, because for some people it is important to know whether somebody died in the property or not. And this isn't something that they have to disclose up front. It's not actually a material latent defect, but if you do ask, they do have to let you know. Sometimes there is this interesting middle ground where the seller will tell their agent that they don't want that disclosed. And so now they're in a pickle because basically they have to respect what the seller's wishes are and they owe their duty of confidentiality to that seller. However, at the same time, they're supposed to disclose this information as well. But typically you can read between the lines because at this point in time, they would probably say, I'm not at liberty to disclose. And if they're saying that, you can kind of put 2 and 2 together. But also just trying to get them to state whether or not there are any organized crime or gang members, sexual offenders in the area, or any robberies or vandalizations on the property. And it's to the best of their ability. I have some people who really don't like this one and cross it out. Can potentially raise a red flag, but I had somebody one time that said it felt offensive. I don't understand where they came up with that. Maybe that was just an excuse, but anyways, you deal with that at the time that it comes up. Now, there are hundreds of other conditions and subjects that can be put into a contract. You can essentially even create them yourself if there's something very specific that you're looking into. This is my general kind of standardized contract, and I typically will pull things and add to it or take away depending on what it is. But for the most part, this is what I'm going to have on most of my standard contracts for a Strata property purchase. Once again, you've got the initials at the bottom of the page. And continuing on, and something I didn't address earlier is that at the top of every page, they also have the property address, which will auto-populate just in case you forget what property you're purchasing. Now we move on to the completion, possession, and adjustment dates. And so the completion date generally is going to be 1 to potentially 5 days afterwards, dependent on what dates you're looking for, what dates the seller's looking for. And then possession date, this is the day that you're actually moving into the property, getting the keys, whereas completion is when you are essentially, title is transferring to your name and the funds are transferring from you, the buyer, to the seller. And then the adjustment date is when any adjustments will be dealt with. So this is typically on possession. And so typically the biggest things here are going to be property taxes, strata fees, and things of that nature. So to simplify it, if you moved in on the very middle of the year, I guess you can't technically do that because it's 365, but let's just say you did, the property taxes would be split in half. You would be owing half of it. The seller would be owing half of it. And this is dealt with at the lawyer's office on the statement of adjustment. So you don't have to worry about calculating this yourself. They will provide this to you prior to actually having to pay it, of course, and it's all dealt with when you schedule your meeting with your lawyer or notary. Possession, also we're going to have the time at which you're going to, and it's important to have vacant possession in here, and more specifically if it is a tenanted property, but we're not going to get into tenanted properties in this video. Then moving on, we're going to have the list of included items. So anything that is fixed or a fixture is supposed to stay. For instance, anything that is built in, that would actually stay at the property. But it's important just to try and prevent any sort of confusion to write things in here if you're unsure whether it's going to be staying or not. Now, the general things that we're going to have, there's already a list on here that says all blinds, awning, screen doors, and windows, curtain rods, tracks, and valances, fixed mirrors, fixed carpeting, electric, plumbing, heating, and air conditioning fixtures, and all appurtenances and attachments. And then so additionally, I'm going to add all the appliances. So for instance, clothes washer, dryer, fridge, stove, dishwasher, all drapes and window coverings, microwave. This one, sometimes they want to take, sometimes they don't. I always write it in. And if it is there, then great. If not, that's okay. Then any and all sets of keys, fobs, and remotes, any and all windows, screens, curtains, and 2 visitors parking passes. Now, if there is something else that maybe it is custom to that home and it fits very well, but it's not necessarily a fixture, this is where you can write it in. Sometimes I'll have people write in things such as furniture or other things. Now, generally we like to deal with that outside of the contract, but sometimes we will write those things in and just kind of see based on our conversation and what the sellers are looking to do if we can get some of that stuff. But generally these are the things that we're going to focus on, and we leave the rest out of the contract. And then excluding, so the important thing here would be, so if you have a good agent, generally they're going to speak to the listing realtor prior to find out, hey, what sort of dates are the sellers looking for? Is there anything that we're missing? Is there any inclusions and exclusions that they specifically want? Because sometimes maybe there is something that's built in, but it's important to them. It has some sort of significant value. And if you know that ahead of time, you can put it into the exclusion section. It can save a transfer of the contract back and forth, or just show them that, again, you're being proactive and you're trying to work with them. So other things is making sure, for instance, maybe there's 3 fridges and 2 of them aren't working and they're stored in the garage. You want to just make it very, very clear that you don't want that staying there, that you want it removed by the seller or other things of this nature. So essentially that is what this section is for, but these are going to be the primary things that we're going to have there. Now, this is an important part of the contract as well. So basically they're stating that the property and all the included items will be in substantially the same condition at possession date as when it was viewed by you on whatever that given date was. So if you were to go and view the property on February 1st, and when you move in on April 1st, there's a big hole in the wall that wasn't previously there, we're going to have that dealt with. So again, just important to make sure you have the correct dates here, just in case it does come up at a later time. Now, moving on, I'm not going to go over the next aspects of the contract in too much detail. These are things that are written into the contract, can't be changed, but if you do have questions about them, of course, let me know. Once again, signatures in the bottom corners. And then moving on, continued. Again, another page full of things that are just put in place. They are in the contract. We cannot change them. So I'm not going to go over that. Again, signatures, property at the top. And then the next important aspect of this contract is typically 20A. So restriction on assignment of contract. So basically this was added because of the fact that they were concerned about shadow flipping and people essentially buying a property and then reselling it while it's still under contract for a profit and taking advantage of people essentially. And so the thing is that this can still be done, and people do alter this aspect of the contract, which you need to provide another form along with it. But essentially what it states is that the buyer and seller agree that the A must not be assigned without written consent of the seller. So basically a lot of times we'll see this crossed out because maybe they want to add their company onto title for tax purposes, or maybe they want to add a family member potentially in the future and they don't want to have to come back to you and ask for the ability to. So maybe they're trying to get the financing on their own, or there's so many different ways. I'm not going to cover them all, but it just allows them to do so without actually having to request your permission. Now, the part that we do want to be a little bit more careful of is part B, where the seller is entitled to any profit resulting from an assignment of the contract by the buyer or any subsequent assignee. Because what I do see, and especially in this market, in hot markets, is that both of these will be crossed out, and the purchaser's sole intention is they're going to write you an offer, give you an extremely long completion and possession date, and they're going to go out and try to find another buyer for your property at a profit during that time period. And if they do so, because this is crossed out, you're not entitled to any of that profit. And how are you going to feel if you just sold your property for $1 million and then 6 months down the line, this person who was supposed to be the purchaser of your property turns around, flips it for a $200,000 profit, never actually moves into it, and now you feel like an idiot because you just lost $200,000 on the sale. So just something to be made aware of. Sometimes you may want to allow them to, because that's the only reason that you're going to get it done. That's a conversation you can have at that point in time. And then moving on to agency disclosure. So essentially just stating that it's very, very clear who you're being represented by and who the other party is being represented by. So this is the seller section right here. So they would have their agent's name and the brokerage, and these sellers would sign off here. And then if you're working with me, my name, my brokerage, you would sign off here, just making it clear that that is who you're working with as designated agents. So again, signatures in the bottom corners. And then these are some of the other forms of potential agency that we very rarely see. However, if anything, it would typically be this disclosure of risks to unrepresented parties. So if somebody comes in and they want to write the offer unrepresented without an agent, there is a whole process for that, but this would be where it is being signed off here, making it very clear that they have no representation. Now, dual agency, which is essentially banned in BC, I've never actually seen a case that's gone through, but essentially means you would be representing both the buyer and the seller. And in this market, it definitely won't work because of the fact that there are all of these different rules and regulations around it, that there isn't somebody in the same market that is able to service that client, that you'd have to be in the super remote market. And so we never really worry about this, but it is there for, I guess, maybe that one-off circumstance in BC at some point in time that comes up that it could potentially happen. And then so just to clarify between the two here, this is if it's a buyer, if they're unrepresented buyer, or the bottom one, if it's a seller who's unrepresented. So a for sale by owner property. If you were writing this contract and presenting it to an owner who didn't have a realtor representing them. And then next we have this acceptance irrevocable. So this was brought in from my understanding because it would make the contract under seal. So there was a lawyer in the recent past who tried to make the argument that the other contracts weren't under seal because they were missing this section. I'm not even going to try and get into the legal aspects of it, but anyways, essentially they're stating that now that you've signed this, you understand that the offer is sealed and the acceptance is irrevocable. Then there's just some more information information on the disclosure of the buyer's right of rescission. As I mentioned, it is 0.25% of the purchase price. And so you're stating that you understand that you cannot waive this right of rescission, because we've had this conversation in the past with our regulators and everyone else that people want to waive this right of rescission to make their offer stronger, because an offer with no rescission period, of course, gives the seller more confidence that it's a true subject-free offer. We don't really have true subject-free offers, in my opinion, anymore, because everybody is given this 3-day rescission period and they can rescind. Yes, there is a small penalty to be paid if they do. However, they've basically taken away the ability for a buyer to do so. And then moving on to page 9, this is where you're actually signing off on what I was talking about above. So the rescission period, after reading this, and then initials in the bottom right and left hand corners again. And then this is just the remainder of the explanation of the rescission period and signing off here that you understand and have read this and basically all the information I just covered, but in more detail. And just stating this is a legal document. Read this entire section and information before you sign. I hope you know that this is a legal document before signing it, but that's okay. And then next on to the actual offer itself. So this is the offer expiry time. This is important because if I'm writing in here that the offer is open until 9 p.m., we need a response and we need to have it signed off by the other party prior to this time. And what some agents will do is they believe that if it's even after that period and they sign off and send a counter offer, that the deal is still alive, and it is not. Do not try and do this. It will come back to bite you in court at some point in time. It may never, but you just want to make sure you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's. So do not ever try and do that. Make sure that the responses are coming in a timely manner. But of course, this aspect can also be used in negotiations. For instance, if you're trying to give somebody a shorter time period to get back to you, there's so many ways to go about this. But the most important thing, as I said, just things need to be done in a timely manner. Time is of the essence. This is important. And then as we move on, we've got that, are you a Canadian citizen, permanent resident as defined by the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act? So for the majority of people, you're going to initial off yes, but it is so important because of what has been implemented now in Canada with the foreign buyer ban and the foreign buyer taxes, that you really understand this. And again, that is a conversation between you and your lawyer, but making sure that you're initialing off in the right box. And then this is actually the first time that you're fully signing on this entire contract. So you've actually got your full name that you're signing off on, and you're printing your name below, of course, just in case the signature is illegible. I think I'm saying that right. And then they have a witness section, but we don't have witnesses if we're using our electronic signing. If you're signing it in person, that's the time when you would actually need to have this witness signed off, but it's not required through electric signatures. Then moving on, we've got again initials from buyers and sellers in the bottom corners, and we're finally onto the final page. And so this date, where they call it acceptance date, this is when the seller originally sends it back, and they're going to put a date in here, which is going to get confusing in a minute, even though this may not be the final acceptance date or when the offer is finally accepted, because it could go back and forth a couple of times. Now, this is where the sellers are initialing off the same as the buyers would be as to whether they're a resident of Canada or not. And then again, they're going to be signing off the exact same way. Now, this new part of the contract that's been added is this notice for buyer's rescission right. And so basically our regulators have stated that this doesn't actually form part of the contract, and it doesn't necessarily need to be filled out. So it gets very confusing as to if there's changes to it or if it needs to be signed off on. I always am just making sure that I am taking all precautions and not giving anybody an out because of one small detail. But typically what's going to happen is that the seller's agent, if they're a good agent, is going to be filling out this information, providing their own office address and email, and that they will deal with this. But sometimes you can have the seller actually put their information in here alone. Typically we don't like to share that private and confidential information. However, it could go either way. Don't really know why they have the facts section in here. Maybe for people out in merit, just kidding. But anyways, if in fact the buyer does use the rescission period to get out of the deal, this is the information provided that they're going to require in order to send over whatever that compensation is. And so this is what I was talking about with the final acceptance date. So So even if up here, the negotiation started and the original offer was written on February 1st, maybe it's taken 4 days. If it's not actually finally accepted and completely signed off on until February 5th, this is where you'd be putting February 5th. Now, based on that, you've got 3 business days starting the following day, which will give us our final day of the right of rescission. So what you have to keep in mind is that holidays and weekends do not count. So if you get your final acceptance date on, let's say, a Tuesday, you're gonna have Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So by Friday midnight, their rescission period is over. However, if it was done on Thursday, day 1 is Friday, skip the weekend, Monday, Tuesday. So Tuesday is actually going to be that final day for the rescission rights until midnight. And if this rescission right period is a little bit confusing, don't worry, it hasn't been implemented for that long. And unless you're writing a subject-free offer, as I've mentioned several times, it doesn't necessarily really pertain to you. However, I will cover it in more detail in a future video, but there you have it. That pretty much summarizes the contract of purchase and sale. And the last thing I'll point out is on this final page, there are no initials required in the bottom corners, but hopefully this gives you a better understanding. So there you have it. There is my comprehensive overview of the contract of purchase and sale. This video went a little longer than I was expecting, but I'd rather you have more information than less. So if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out and I'd be happy to help within my scope. And if you are looking to buy or sell in Surrey, Langley, or the rest of the Lower Mainland, or you just want to chat about real estate, you can scroll down and click the first link in the description to book a call with me at a time that works best for you. If you like videos just like this one, as well as community tours across the Lower Mainland, I also suggest you consider subscribing to our channel. And if now, because you have a better understanding of how the contract of purchase and sale works, and you want to learn more about the buying process itself, you should definitely be checking out my ultimate guide to home buying in BC. Once again, thanks so much for watching. Make sure you keep educating yourself on the BC real estate market, and we'll see you in the next video.